raging fire erupted in the dead of night at the foot of Cedar Pass, engulfing a massive wagon and extinguishing the hopes of dozens of families for survival through the winter. The panicked wagon driver, coughing and sputtering in the soot, managed to desperately pull out a wooden chest before the entire wagon collapsed into a pile of glowing red ashes. The next morning, under the gray sky of Arizona Territory, Grace Lane stood silently before the still smoking wreckage. Her bare hand reached into the muddy ashes, picking up a handful of charred flour. People thought of the daughter of the general store owner, Lane, as a delicate flower needing protection, but they didn't know she was the only one who measured the lives of the entire town through each barrel of lamp oil and each dose of fever medicine. The sound of horses' hooves pounding on the broken gravel shattered the silence. Owen Reed approached. A poor coachman, considered to have no land to call his own to offer shelter to anyone, was now the only one sharp enough to see through the murky truth that was being buried. Owen's calloused, grease-stained hands carefully traced the severed leather strap hidden near the wheel axle. His deep, husky voice echoed in the biting north wind. "The brake cable didn't break in the accident, Grace. Someone cut it in half before the carriage rolled down the hill." Grace's heart tightened with a chilling rage. She rushed to overturn the only salvaged trunk. The roll of cloth and the box of nails were still there, but the box of life-saving medicine and the envelope containing the most important bill of lading were completely gone. Someone didn't just want to burn a shipment. They wanted to kill her entire family. Rushing back to the shop, Grace flipped through her family's thick ledger, her fingers frantically scanning the yellowed pages for a clue. But hidden among the tangled numbers of last night's shipment, a strange, sharp handwriting had been secretly inserted. All debts must be paid in full before the first severe frost. In a windy, sandy frontier like Cedar Pass, having plenty of cash was just a pipe dream. The heart of this land doesn't beat with gold coins, but with the ledger of debts lying on the worn wooden counter of Lane's supply store. People survive the winter by incurring debts for every pound of flour, every box of nails, and repaying with leather, dried meat, or a fragile promise when the cattle season arrives. But today, that ledger has become a verdict. Jacob Lane, Grace's father, sat slumped at the edge of the counter, his voice hoarse as he confessed that he had secretly mortgaged part of the store and the right to receive the next shipment to small farms to buy on credit throughout the dry season. He couldn't stand idly by while children starved to death or livestock perished. But that ironic act of kindness was now dragging his entire family down into the abyss. Beth Lane emerged from the inner room, her hands, rough from hard labor, placed on her husband's shoulders. But her eyes met her daughter's with a chilling coldness that pierced to the bone. She spoke each word clearly and distinctly. "Your father's compassion has kept this town alive, Grace, but never let that compassion become a noose around your own neck." The brass bell outside rang out, shattering the thick, oppressive atmosphere of the shop. Marcus Vane entered, leisurely brushing off the red dust from his expensive coat. The wealthiest manor owner in the region appeared with the refined demeanor of a savior. Marcus never needed to raise his voice. He always knew how to use measured smiles and contracts to suffocate others. He slowly removed his leather gloves, uttering a sweet but cruel offer. Marcus declared his willingness to guarantee the entire enormous debt and use his connections to secure another shipment before the frost arrived. His only condition, spoken casually, was that Jacob agree to officially become one of the family. He wasn't proposing marriage. He was negotiating the merger of an asset called Grace Lane. Grace tilted her chin, her ash-gray eyes unblinking under his imposing gaze. She said coldly, "Mr. Vane's kindness is truly remarkable, but the Lane family isn't in a position to sell off their relatives to pay off their debts." Marcus nodded slightly, a smile still on his lips, but his eyes had turned colder. He put on his hat and walked out the door, inadvertently leaving a thick envelope with a bright red wax seal from the Territorial Bank on the wooden counter. Grace approached, trembling as she pulled out the paper inside, and the sky before her seemed to collapse. Marcus Vane hadn't come to help pay off the debt. His name was prominently displayed as the beneficiary. He was the one who had just seized all of her family's promissory notes. The air at Reed Livery Station was always thick with the smell of horse sweat, leather, and pungent coal smoke. Unlike the glamorous appearance of the Vane estate, this place was rough and muddy. But everyone at Cedar Pass knew an unwritten rule. If Owen Reed, the blacksmith and guide, shook his head at a carriage or a mountain pass, no one should risk their lives attempting it. Grace brushed aside her despair after discovering the promissory note, carrying the severed brake cable as she walked straight into the stable. She ignored the mud clinging to the hem of her dress. In a town where everyone was beginning to tremble before Marcus's power, Owen was the only one Grace trusted enough to confide this truth to. Owen's rough hand took the leather cable from Grace's hand. He traced his calloused fingers along the sharp, clean cut, as carefully as if reading a death sentence. His voice was deep, hoarse, and firm. "This cut isn't new. The culprit understands the wagon's durability very well. He cut just deep enough so the cable wouldn't break at the start of travel, but would explode when the wagon was at its heaviest load on the deadly slope at the foot of the pass." Owen looked up at Grace. He didn't offer empty words of comfort, but his gaze took in her every subtle movement. He knew she hated the smell of spilled lamp oil. He knew she could always mentally calculate the price of flour faster than any merchant. And at that moment, he noticed Grace's fingers were gripping the edge of her sleeve, an unconscious habit whenever she was trying to hide her overwhelming fear. Owen wanted to step forward. He wanted to use his grease-stained hands to hold her back, to shield her from the storm of debt threatening to engulf the Lane family. But his worn boots stuck to the ground. The self-doubt of a poor, landless laborer always reminded him that Grace deserved someone with status and money, not someone who only knew how to befriend mules. As Grace's figure disappeared behind the creaky wooden door, Sam Cole, Owen's apprentice blacksmith and closest friend, slowly emerged from the shadows behind the furnace. Sam slammed his soiled rag down on the table, his eyes glaring at his friend. Sam snarled, each word like a sledgehammer pounding into Owen's silent shell. "Are you blind, Owen? Marcus doesn't just want to marry that girl. If he swallows up Lane's shop, every small farm in Cedar Pass will have to sell their blood at his price to survive the winter." The scene froze, the crackling of the forge's fire seemingly ceasing. Sam Cole tilted his chin, uttering a question that pierced to the very core, suffocating the atmosphere of the horse station. "Are you going to just stand here cowardly and watch Marcus turn her into the final clause in a promissory note?" After the church service, the people of Cedar Pass gathered in the open field next to the feed mill. Amidst the shabby crowd in their worn-out clothes, Marcus Vane stood out like a star. He made no secret of his ambition, openly displaying his particular interest in Grace before dozens of curious eyes. His politeness was no longer an act of help, but an invisible noose tightening around her reputation. He leisurely approached, smiling and inquiring about Mrs. Beth's health. then deliberately lowered his voice so that those around could hear. "A woman as intelligent and strong as you, Grace, deserves shelter under a sturdy roof before the winter storm arrives." Grace held her head high, responding with a cold, polite smile and measured words, resolutely blocking any attempts at manipulation. In the distance, hidden behind stacks of barley sacks, Owen Reed silently observed. His clothes were still stained with red dust and smelled faintly of the stables. The film slowed down as Marcus's hand, clad in an expensive leather glove, lightly slid across the back of the chair behind Grace. It was a touch that didn't cross any line, but it was a cruel move to plant a decisive message in the town's mind. Grace Lane was about to belong to the Vane estate. Owen's jaw tightened, his knuckles turning white. He instinctively took a step forward, ready to shatter that disgusting charade, but then stopped. The shadow of poverty, of an unknown, pulled him back. He froze in place. And at that very moment, Grace's gray eyes swept across the crowd, catching that weak hesitation. Disappointment flashed in Grace's eyes, like a blade coated in ice. Her greatest wound wasn't Marcus's dominance, but Owen's retreat. She didn't need a blacksmith wielding a fist to protect her. What she needed was a man who dared to cast aside his cowardice and stand proudly beside her in the eye of the storm. Leaving the suffocating crowd to hide her despair, Grace inadvertently circled around the quiet, secluded corner behind the warehouse. The furtive whispers of two Vane henchmen suddenly reached her ears. They were grumbling about a wooden box of fever medicine that should have been reduced to ashes along with the wagon. A chill ran down Grace's spine. The final piece had fit into the cruel picture. Marcus hadn't simply burned the shipment. He had deliberately taken away the vital supply of medicine to completely destroy the reputation of Lane's supply store, forcing small farms to turn to him for the lives of the town's children. Grace turned on her heel and rushed towards the store, seething with rage. But as she pushed open the shattered glass door, a desperate scene awaited her. Her father, Jacob Lane, his shoulders slumped like a dead tree, was trembling as he signed the deadly debt extension papers brought by Marcus's henchmen. The knot had been tightened, and her family had no way out. The air in the store was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Jacob's iron pin smeared discontinuous black ink across the debt extension papers, as if he were signing a death sentence for his own family. There was a limit to everything. Grace lunged forward, sweeping the paper off the counter. She didn't scream, but her gray eyes blazed with the fire of utter defiance. Faced with his daughter's pent-up rage, Jacob bowed his head, his hands covering his aged face. The veil of secrecy was finally torn open. He choked out the confession that after last year's drought, numerous families in Cedar Pass had been left destitute and unable to repay their debts. If he heartlessly closed the warehouse, the children would starve, and the livestock would wither and die on the red earth. To save the town's dying breath, Jacob had made a fatal mistake. He secretly mortgaged part of his inventory and the right to receive the winter supplies. And Marcus Vane appeared like a persistent vulture. He offered no help. He used his money to secretly buy back all of Jacob's promissory notes from loan sharks outside the territory. Jacob trembled. He had never wanted to force his daughter, but the weight of debt had crushed his shoulders to the point where he had no strength left to resist. A chilling pain pierced Grace's chest, but she refused to collapse. She wasn't a lifeless commodity to be weighed and measured. Leaning her hands on the worn wooden counter, she declared firmly in the cold, resolute voice of the frontier, "I will do everything I can to save this shop, but I will absolutely never become the price to pay for any debt." From the shadows of the storage room, Beth Lane emerged. For years, she had remained silent, backing down from the financial decisions of men under the guise of women shouldn't interfere. But today, She cast aside all those rotten prejudices. Beth placed her calloused hand on the ledger, her eyes fixed on her husband, her words sharp as razor blades. "You can lose a shop, Jacob, but a father must never lose his daughter while she is still standing right in front of him." Her mother's nudge shattered all the shackles in Grace's mind. She snatched the ledger of debts towards herself. She wouldn't sit idly by, waiting for Owen's pity or a miracle from any other man. The flickering oil lamp illuminated the young woman's resolute face as she began flipping through the pages, categorizing even the smallest debts of the estates. Grace calculated with lightning speed. Who could pay in cash? Who could settle debts with beef jerky, leather, or mules to pull carts? And who was being pressured by Marcus's hand to buy goods through his estate? The battle for survival had officially begun, and Grace's weapon wasn't guns and bullets, but the numbers that spoke. But when her finger glided to the shipping costs of previous shipments, a horrifying paradox struck her. The shipping fee through Cedar Pass had been inexplicably doubled. Grace held her breath, hastily pressing the paper against the oil lamp to get a better look. In the bottom corner of the crumpled receipt, a signature confirming the exorbitant fee was clearly visible. It didn't belong to any independent shipping company. The signature bore the watermark of Marcus Vane, the estate representative. A cloud of red dust billowed as Grace rushed out of the shop, clutching the crumpled shipping receipt tightly in her hand. She went straight to Reed Livery Station. There, Owen Reed, bare-chested in the dry sun, pounded a red-hot horseshoe with a sledgehammer. Grace slammed the paper against the anvil. Owen stopped hammering. Dust smeared his cheek. He picked up the paper, squinting as he read the numbers. Owen's voice was even but firm, shattering any last vestiges of doubt. This shipping fee was sheer madness. No shipment through Cedar Pass has ever been so exorbitantly expensive. This wasn't a business fee. This was a noose, already tightened to strangle the Lane family, driving them to bankruptcy sooner. The silence in the horse station was broken. For the first time, the taciturn blacksmith cast aside his barren self-doubt. Owen looked Grace straight in the eye and said firmly he would use his homemade truck and mule to cross the snowy pass and secure a new shipment for the town. Grace froze, immediately refusing. She proudly declared that she hadn't come here to beg for anyone's pity, but Owen stepped forward, breaking the 1-foot distance he always maintained to avoid her. His calloused hand pointed toward the deserted town outside. "This isn't pity, Grace. If Lane's supply store collapses, the entire town of Cedar Pass will starve. I'm going on this trip for the honor of a man living on the frontier." The words of love remained unspoken, but his commitment at this moment weighed more heavily than 1,000 empty declarations of love. For the first time, Grace saw the grimy man before her not as an outsider, but as the only steadfast pillar of support amidst the storm of debt. But news in a small town spreads faster than wildfire, and Marcus Vane was never one to tolerate obstacles. That very afternoon, he appeared at Reed Livery Station. His gleaming leather boots churned through the mud and straw as he tossed a stack of contracts onto the worn wooden table before Owen. Marcus smiled with the condescending smirk of a superior, declaring the withdrawal of all horse rental and carriage maintenance contracts from the Vane estate. He severed Owen's largest source of income with a snap of his fingers, leaving a chilling warning that pierced his eardrums. A wise man knows what he can lose before deciding who to stand with. Owen stood motionless, his teeth clenched, but he absolutely refused to back down. The poor blacksmith had officially declared war on the most powerful monster in Arizona. He was willing to sacrifice his own safety to gamble on this fight, but the shadows of the frontier always lurked vile revenge. That night, in the bone-chilling cold of the frost, someone had silently pried open the wooden door lock of Reed Livery Station. The next morning, the leather reins were cut and left lying haphazardly on the cold ground. One of Owen's best, strongest draft horses had vanished, leaving only jagged footprints leading straight towards the abyss of Cedar Pass. The sky dawned a cold gray. At the horse station, Owen silently tightened the reins, tucking his Winchester rifle into its holster. He intended to go alone to find the only remaining draft horse that had been stolen, but the sharp click of her heels on the cold, hard ground made him stop. Grace Lane was standing there. Her ash-gray eyes were fixed on the severed piece of leather strap lying on the ground, and she recognized it instantly. This clean cut was exactly like the slash on the brake cable of the wagon the night before. Owen frowned, flatly refusing to let her follow. The line between the town and Arizona's Red Canyon was a line between life and death, where masked men could open fire without reason. But Grace tilted her chin, her voice cold and sharp as a blade. "I'm not a fragile piece of porcelain to be hidden in a shop window, Owen. If this trap is set to ensnare my family, I'll find the one who set it myself." Unable to resist her resolve, Owen gritted his teeth and agreed. They followed the chaotic hoofprints in the red mud deeper into Cedar Pass Canyon. The terrain was steep, jagged with cracked rocks and dry, thorny bushes. The air grew thinner and colder. A sudden north wind swept through the ravine, bringing with it the bone-chilling cold of the first frost of the season. Throughout the journey, not a single sweet word or sentimentality was uttered. Their love on the frontier was woven with harshness. When the wind changed direction and bit at their skin, Owen silently took off his worn old coat and draped it over Grace's trembling shoulders. When Owen's hand was cut and bleeding by the thorny rope, Grace didn't cry out in fear. She quickly tore a strip of cloth from her coarse dress and calmly bandaged his wound. Their actions fit together perfectly, like the gears of a survival machine. Owen, with the skills of a mountain dweller, sensed the horse's unusual direction. Meanwhile, Grace, with her keen eyesight, spotted a piece of coarse canvas bearing the Lane shop's seal, caught on a branch of deer antler thorns. They didn't find the horse, but the tracks led them to an abandoned stone hut hidden deep in a dark ravine. The hut door was slightly ajar. There was no one inside, but the piles of things on the cold ground were more horrifying than a corpse. There were torn sacks of flour, coils of rope, and most importantly, the wooden box of fever medicine that had apparently burned to ashes in the ravine the night before. The henchmen hadn't destroyed the shipment, they'd stolen it, hidden it here to cut off Lane shop's lifeline. Rummaging through the stolen goods, Grace's fingers trembled as she touched a crumpled bill of lading tucked at the bottom of the medicine box. She pulled it out, leaning toward the faint light filtering through the rocks. In the bottom corner of the paper was an unmistakable symbol, the embossed bullhead seal of the Marcus Vane estate. All the crimes now bore the name of the mastermind. But the moment Grace slipped that life-or-death piece of paper into her pocket, a rustling sound of rubble came from outside the shed. Owen reacted instantly, his blood-stained hands snatching the Colt pistol from its holster, pulling Grace back into the darkness. Out in the light, at the mouth of the only ravine leading out of the chasm, two burly men on horseback were silently advancing, their rifles loaded. Grace and Owen's only escape route was blocked. Their quest for truth had now turned into a deadly trap with no way out. The sound of crumbling stones under the boots of the henchmen grew closer and closer. The light in front of the shack was obscured by the cold barrels of rifles. Cornered, Owen didn't risk firing his weapon with Grace by his side. Driven by the survival instinct of someone who knew every nook and cranny of Cedar Pass, he gripped Grace's waist tightly, pulling her through a narrow, damp crevice hidden behind the stone shack. They crawled across the sharp rocks, forced to abandon their horse and all their stolen goods to save their lives. The smoke, dust, and biting cold of the canyon engulfed them. The only things Grace clung to, like a lifeline, were the wooden box containing fever medicine and the crumpled bill of lading with the bull's head stamp. By the time the two of them, exhausted, dragged themselves back to town, the Arizona Territory sky had already darkened. In the dilapidated wooden shed behind the stable, under the flickering storm lamp, Sam Cole helped them piece together the horrifying fragments. The crumpled bill of lading wasn't simply evidence of a robbery. When compared to the tangled numbers in the Lane family's ledger, a vast, ruthless network unfolded on the wooden table. The frame froze. Grace's breathing quickened as her eyes scanned the summary column. Marcus Vane orchestrated it all, not just to force her into marriage. The landowner, disguised as a gentleman, was silently devouring Cedar Pass. He had secretly acquired all the small farm's debt papers, seized control of the mountain pass, and signed an exclusive contract to supply winter goods. The plot had completely shifted. This battle was no longer about whether Grace Lane would be forced into marriage with Marcus. It was a bloody, silent fight to the death. If Grace were to give up and lose the shop, or grit her teeth and walk down the aisle with Marcus, he would hold the economic lifeline of the entire region in his hands. The poor people of Cedar Pass would forever lose their freedom, becoming debt slaves, forced to sell their labor and livestock cheaply to the Vane estate in exchange for food to survive the winter. And as if to extinguish any last glimmer of hope for resistance, at dawn the next day, the border region's laws dealt a fatal blow. A clerk from the Vane estate calmly knocked on the Lane supply store's door, tossing a cold, sharp legal letter onto the counter. Marcus officially issued an ultimatum. 10 days. The Lane family had only 10 days before the first severe frost would engulf the entire town. If the enormous debt was not paid in cash, Marcus Vane would have the territorial court legally seize the entire store and its winter supply rights. Pushed to the brink of disaster, Grace refused to sit idly by and wait for death. She decided to play a high-stakes game, asking Sam Cole to call all the small farm owners to a meeting at the store to find a way out. But that night, when the oil lamps were lit and Grace patiently waited behind the wooden counter, the store door remained silently closed. Not a single footstep. No one dared to show up. Marcus's invisible power had sown utter fear, stifling the courage of the entire town. The Lane supply store was shrouded in an eerie silence. Grace lit every oil lamp, flipped open the ledger on the counter, and waited for a miracle of unity. But as the church bells chimed slowly, signaling that the appointed time had long passed, only a few timid farmers cautiously entered. They brought no cash, no support, only averted bows and desperate silence. Grace did not give up. She boldly presented her final survival plan to save the town. She did not demand immediate repayment of their debts. She earnestly pleaded with them to contribute anything of value: a few coins, some animal hides, dried meat, labor to reinforce the barn, or even a horse to be lent. Lane's shop will use all of its makeshift assets as collateral to secure an urgent shipment from the central station, and Owen Reed will personally drive the wagon through the blizzard. But the only response to that heart-wrenching plea was a weary sigh and retreating footsteps. The cruel reality of the frontier region struck Grace. Those who had survived the drought thanks to her father's kindness now cowered before the immense power of the Vane estate. They trembled with fear. Marcus held all their debts. If they dared side with the Lanes, he would immediately cut off their supply lines, revoke their grazing rights, and freeze them to death before winter even began. Grace stood silently behind the wooden counter. She didn't shed tears, nor did she utter a word of reproach, for she understood the harsh price of survival. But her heart ached as she realized the bitter truth. When her family extended a helping hand to the community, they were benefactors. But when she needed the community's support, she was left with only utter solitude. Just as the darkness of helplessness threatened to engulf Grace, Owen Reed stepped back from the corner of the room. This blacksmith had never owned a large fortune in his life. The dilapidated stable with its few old wagons was his entire lifeblood, his honor, and his only refuge. But Owen didn't hesitate. He ripped out the ownership papers for Reed Livery and slammed them down on the wooden counter. The loud crash shattered the cowardice of the room. Ignoring the shocked murmurs, Owen declared in a harsh voice, he would use Reed Livery as collateral for the shipment. If the wagon failed, if the goods didn't arrive in time, he would be left penniless, forever losing his only possession in this territory. Grace snatched the papers in alarm. She resolutely shook her head, refusing to drag him into a gamble that was almost certain to fail. She didn't want him to sacrifice his meager life for her family's debt. But Owen took another step, placing his rough, scarred hand over Grace's trembling hand. His eyes blazed, unwavering and silent in the darkness of the night. His voice was deep and warm, carrying the weight of a crumbling mountain. You are risking your life to protect your freedom, Grace. I cannot stand by you and merely offer a promise. Owen's desperate act ignited the last glimmer of hope for the Lane family. However, walls have ears and forests have ears. At the opulent Vane estate, a henchman secretly rode back to report the news. Marcus smirked, coldly tossing his glowing cigar into the fireplace. He recognized the dangerous rise of the taciturn blacksmith, and he decided he would no longer play the game of patience. That night, Marcus immediately dispatched a troop of henchmen on horseback at lightning speed towards the central train station. They carried gold coins and an embargo order. The last shipment of the season would not only fail to cross the pass, but it would be intercepted and seized before Owen could even apply the brakes. The next morning, Reed Livery Station buzzed with the clanking of chains and the neighing of mules. Owen, Sam Cole, and the two remaining men in town who dared to risk their lives were busily reinforcing the largest wagon. Owen's grease-stained hands checked each brake pad, attached extra tow ropes, loaded thick woolen blankets, repair tools, and a spare barrel of lamp oil. His Winchester rifle sat on the driver's seat, not to provoke a cheap shootout, but to fight off hungry wolves and the most primal dangers of the frontier. Unlike the sentimental love stories of the city, Grace didn't tearfully chase after the carriage to bid farewell. At Cedar Pass, they divided their battle lines. Owen fought on the mountain pass with blood and sweat, while Grace held out at the store, using her papers, reputation, and debt records to defend the last line of defense. Before Owen whipped the carriage, their eyes met in the cold mist. No promises of safety, only a resolute nod etched into the harsh landscape. But the fight for survival wasn't limited to the cliffs. As soon as Owen's carriage disappeared from view, Grace shrewdly discovered a horrifying truth from the postman. Last night, Marcus's henchmen had ridden along the express trail to the central station. They were carrying money to bribe officials and spread rumors that Lane's supply store had gone bankrupt and absolutely could not be supplied on credit. If Owen arrived without cash, he would return empty-handed. The scene shifts to Grace's sharp, decisive action. She flips through the ledger, writes an emergency financial guarantee herself, forces her father to sign it, and affixes the Lane store's official seal to it with red beeswax. She slips the paper into the breast pocket of a local messenger boy, pays him to ride his fastest horse along a shortcut through the dry ravine, determined to thwart Marcus's cowardly revenge before Owen reaches the station. And Grace won the battle of wits. At the central station, the red-stamped guarantee, along with the Lane store's years of prestige, shattered the embargo. Bags of flour, crates of coffee, iron nails, and life-threatening medicine were loaded onto Owen's wagon. But the true, most ruthless enemy of the Arizona territory doesn't bear the Vane name. It bears the name nature. On the way back, as the heavy carriage trudged up the treacherous slope of Cedar Pass, the sky suddenly turned a deep, leaden black. The wind shifted. A harsh, early-season frost roared down from the mountaintop, carrying razor-sharp ice shards that lashed directly at people's faces. Suddenly, a deafening crack ripped through the howling wind. The wagon lurched violently, tilting sharply to one side. The donkeys bleated in panic, desperately clinging to the slippery stone pavement with their iron hooves. The oak wheels at the rear had snapped under the weight of the steep incline. The scene froze. Owen's pupils contracted. This wasn't just an accident. This was a terrifying ghost from the past, tearing at his heart. Many years ago, Owen's father had also perished in a fateful delivery, crushed by the wagon at this very same treacherous bend, while trying to get his goods across before the storm. The most primal fear of a wagon driver surged, suffocating the blacksmith's chest. But Owen pushed aside the haunting thoughts. Ignoring his bare hands, which were red from the friction with the ice and snow, he frantically plunged into the mud, using a spare piece of wood and lengths of leather rope to try and temporarily tie the wagon's axle back in place. His breath came out in plumes of white smoke amidst the sub-zero temperatures. Just as Owen was gritting his teeth and tightening the final knot, a chilling premonition made him freeze. He slowly raised his head, his gaze sweeping across the thick fog that blanketed the red rocky mountainside directly above him. There, faintly visible through the stark white frost, were the imprints of brand new leather boots trampling the dry grass. Owen and his carriage were not alone in the storm. Marcus's henchmen had silently followed them from the central station. They stood high above, arms crossed, looking down like ghosts, patiently waiting for the blizzard and despair to finish their job of ending the lives of those who stood in their way. The final frost had lashed its icy whips down upon Cedar Pass. The wind howled through the cracks in the wooden houses, carrying the breath of death. The deadline had arrived, but on the path leading into town, not a single wagon could be seen. Rumors spread like wildfire. Owen Reed had perished in the canyon, the shipment was lost, and Reed Livery was about to be foreclosed. Despair enveloped Cedar Pass like a shroud. At that darkest moment, the cracked glass door of the Lane supply store was pushed open. Marcus Vane entered, gliding through the biting cold outside with a ruthlessly composed and impeccable air. His coat was spotless, his expensive leather boots pounding the death countdown on the wooden floor. He was followed by 2 burly henchmen and a secretary carrying a thick stack of legal documents. Quiet! No shouting. Marcus Vane didn't need crude violence when he held the most deadly weapon in the frontier. He placed Jacob's signed promissory note on the counter. His voice was calm, polite, yet carried the weight of a guillotine slowly descending. The first frost has arrived, Jacob. The contract has expired, but I am not heartless. Marcus shifted his hawk-like gaze to Grace, who stood tall behind the wooden counter, her chin slightly raised in pride. He delivered his final ultimatum, a marriage proposal laced with oppression. If Grace agreed to marry him right here, he would tear up the promissory note, save the shop, and preserve Jacob Lane's honor. If she refused, he would use the power of the territorial court to seize all remaining inventory and permanently strip the Lane family of their winter distribution rights. Jacob Lane was on the verge of collapse. His aged shoulders trembled, and he slammed his hand on the table, trying to shout that he would take all the blame upon himself and beg Marcus to spare his daughter. But the voice of a penniless man in the Arizona territory carried no weight. Beth Lane stepped forward, not weeping, not urging her daughter to sacrifice herself. She simply silently grasped Grace's cold hand. The choice now rested entirely with her. Grace glanced around. The screen slowly panned across the empty wooden shelves, the yellowed ledger, the desperate wrinkles on her father's forehead. And outside, through the frost-covered window pane, were the figures of the townspeople, huddled together in silent cowardice. They held their breath, waiting for her to sell herself for their food. If Grace refused, her family would lose everything, thrown onto the streets in the harsh winter. But if she agreed, she would forever acknowledge that a woman from the West was nothing more than a commodity, a mere pawn that could be used as collateral for a debt, like a mule or a sack of flour. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Marcus smiled smugly, waiting for a submissive bow. But Grace pulled her hand away from her mother's. She confronted the powerful landowner directly, her voice sharp, cold, and clear. "You can take this shop, Marcus, but I am absolutely not its collateral." Marcus's smile vanished. The gentlemanly mask was torn away, revealing the true nature of a tyrant enraged at being stripped of control. He hissed through clenched teeth, gesturing to his henchmen. "Confiscate all the goods. Don't leave a single grain of wheat." The thugs swaggered forward, raising their hands to overturn the wooden counter. But just as chaos was about to erupt, a deafening sound ripped through the eardrums of everyone in the room. Not gunshots, but the shrill, heavy ringing of brass bells, mingled with the clanging of iron chains, rising above the howling storm, echoing from the end of Main Street. The glass door of Lane's shop was blown open by the biting wind, slamming against the wooden wall. All eyes in the room turned in horror towards Main Street, which was engulfed in frost. From within the murky white mist, a massive wagon sped through the storm. Mules pulled it, panting heavily, foam freezing into chunks of ice. The rear wheels, bound together with leather straps and makeshift wooden braces, dug deep grooves into the muddy ground. Silent and imposing in the driver's seat, Owen Reed appeared like a bronze statue sculpted in the midst of the storm. His coat was torn to shreds, dried blood clung to his mud-stained, snow-covered cheek, but the blacksmith's eyes blazed with an unquenchable rage. The cart had returned, bringing with it the breath of life: flour, salt, medicine, lamp oil, iron nails, and rope. Marcus Vane stood frozen. His henchmen recoiled as Owen leaped to the ground, striding with long steps straight into the shop. He didn't swing his fist, nor did he bother with his rifle. What he slammed down on the worn wooden counter, right in front of Marcus, was the weight of truth. A stack of papers stained with blood and mud. Owen's hoarse-sharp voice rang out in the silence of the town lurking outside the gate. Confirmation from the central station. Your henchman used bribery to impose sanctions on the Lane family. And here, the wax-covered testimony of the coachman at the rest stop confirms that the Vane estate paid to hire someone to cut the brakes on the coach last night. Grace no longer hid behind her father. She stepped forward, standing proudly alongside Owen. Her small but resolute hand flipped the ledger of debts toward the crowd. With the clear voice of a woman who knew the economic lifeline of Cedar Pass, Grace exposed the monster's entire wicked plan. Marcus had inflated shipping costs, collected promissory notes, and then orchestrated a disastrous cargo loss to force the town into starvation, thereby compelling her into a manipulative marriage. Jacob Lane, the father who had once collapsed under the weight of his burden, now held his head high. He stepped forward before his neighbors, boldly admitting that the enormous debt stemmed from his having allowed them to buy on credit throughout the drought. He wasn't speaking out of gratitude. He was speaking the truth, to prove that kindness wasn't a crime to be trampled upon. The wall of fear that had long surrounded Cedar Pass suddenly crumbled. As Marcus's darkness was exposed to the light of the debt ledger and the blood-stained wagon, the townspeople began to stir. The cowardly silence was gone. A grimy rancher stepped forward, tossing a wad of calf sales money onto the counter. Another brought thick bundles of animal hides. Someone pledged to reinforce the entire barn with their own strength. Another brought the best draft horse to pay off the debt. Sam Cole, the grimy blacksmith's apprentice, patted his chest and confidently vouched for the entire cost of repairing the wagon. And Beth Lane, the quiet, unassuming mother, stepped forward and placed the most precious jewelry box of her life on the wooden surface. She didn't use her dowry to save her daughter from her marriage. She used it to stand alongside the community and preserve their shared home. Marcus Vane stood alone amidst the throng. In his hand was still the legally binding promissory note, but he had been stripped of his ultimate weapon, the silence and fear of the town. With the timely arrival of goods and the unanimous financial guarantee of the entire community, the Lane family's debt was legally eligible for an extension by the courts. The powerful landowner gritted his teeth, crumpled the paper, turned, and strode quickly into the freezing mist, leaving behind a collapsing empire of manipulation. The battle for survival had ended with the victory of those who refused to bow. But as the crowd dispersed and the cheers subsided, Grace turned to search for her hero. In the distance, under the torrential snow, Owen Reed stood silently, stroking the mane of his horse. The blacksmith, having just defeated a brutal force, now huddled in silence, clinging tightly to the wooden wagon, as if he still couldn't believe he had the right to step forward, to truly reach out and touch the woman he loved. Night fell heavily over Arizona territory. A biting north wind howled through the Red Rock canyons, carrying the bone-chilling cold of the frost. But tonight, inside the Lane supply store, the oil lamp burned brightly, radiating the warmth of rebirth. Grace gently closed her ledger and pushed open the door to the wooden porch. In the flickering light filtering through the window, she saw Owen. The wagon was in place, The mules had been moved into their stable, but the sullen blacksmith was still bent over, meticulously checking each knot on the worn reins. It wasn't the carefulness of a coachman. It was the awkward confusion of a man desperately trying to escape the emotions screaming within him. Grace approached, her voice blending with the cold wind, yet strong enough to tear through his rough exterior. "You've shown up today, Owen." His hand, gripping the rope, froze. His knuckles turned white. He slowly released the rope, still hesitant to look up at her. His voice choked, hoarse as if he'd swallowed deep-seated dust. "I should have shown up a long time ago, Grace." Owen turned around. For the first time in his life, the blacksmith cast aside the ingrained self-doubt that had seeped into his very being. He looked directly into her ash-gray eyes, confessing with the raw honesty of a lovesick fool. He had loved her for years, but the shadow of poverty, of a man with only calloused hands and a few rickety carts, had bound his mouth shut. He had once thought someone like her was a proud mountain peak beyond his reach. "But I was wrong," Owen said, each word echoing on the solid wooden steps. "I used to think that the one worthy of standing beside you had to be someone capable of providing you with a fortune. But today, I understand. Loving you isn't about protecting or possessing you. Loving you means daring to stand proudly beside you, even if the price is your life, so that you have the freedom to choose your own life." There was no hurried embrace, no tearful outbursts. Women from the border regions love with hearts of steel and pride. Grace didn't melt immediately. She looked at him, pouring out the hurt she had suppressed for so long. "I waited for you, Owen, but I will never, not again, wait for a man so silent that he makes me doubt my own worth." That sharp accusation made Owen's stomach ache, but he understood. He didn't beg her to forget his cowardly procrastination. He didn't offer empty promises of wealth and glory. He only asked for a chance to start over, in the true way of a man from the West. Not with words, but with a clear presence in every day to come. The wind and snow still howled, but a fire had truly been kindled in Cedar Pass. Grace quickened her pace. She reached out, gently placing her soft fingers on the bleeding scratch on Owen's calloused hand. A wound caused by the reins tearing as he strained to pull the wagon over the treacherous pass. Grace's eyes were still, deep as the cliffs at dawn. She whispered, but each word seemed etched into the stone. "I don't need the richest man in this territory, Owen. What I need is someone who will never turn his back and run away when I'm alone in the storm." Owen turned his hand over, grasping Grace's icy fingers. The warmth dispelled all the frost. His eyes shone brightly, responding with an eternal vow of the frontier. "Then from today, Grace, I will never turn away again." A few days later, the first severe frost finally descended upon Arizona territory. A blanket of icy snow blanketed the edges of the Red Rock Canyon, freezing even the most desolate paths. Yet, inside the Lane supply store, the fire in the fireplace and the oil lamp burned tenaciously. The store was no longer overflowing with goods as it once was, not wealthy nor completely safe, but it had survived. The people of Cedar Pass arrived one after another. No one spoke much, nor were there grand expressions of gratitude or empty promises. A bundle of leather was placed on the counter, a sack of dried beans, a tarnished silver coin, a promise to hammer nails into the barn roof before the next snowstorm. Cedar Pass had finally learned a bloody lesson. A town's freedom never lay in the hands of a wealthy landowner, but in the people who dared to keep their life or death oaths to one another. dawn, while the frost on the porch hadn't yet melted, Owen Reed arrived. He didn't bring the elaborate, dreamy bouquets of wildflowers from city romances. The blacksmith placed on the worn wooden counter a perfectly intact barrel of lamp oil salvaged from the stormy journey, and a brand new, incredibly strong leather brake cable. Grace's gaze stopped at the leather cable. It immediately pulled her memory back to that fateful night at the foot of the mountain pass, where the wagon burst into flames because a section of the cable had been cut, where the darkest days began. But this time, the cable on the counter wasn't broken or stained. It was intact, supple, and strong, a living testament to the strength that needed to be bound together to survive the storm. Owen took off his worn hat, his calm eyes gazing deeply into Grace. He spoke softly, his deep, warm voice echoing amidst the crackling of the burning wood. "The first time I saw you, I thought you were something far away, proud and unattainable, just like the vibrant red cliffs of Cedar Pass." Grace smiled faintly. Her smile truly brightened the day, dispelling the weariness and harshness of the past few days. She looked up at him, softly asking, "And now?" Owen looked at her, then around the quiet shop, at the oil lamp still shining brightly after a long, frosty night. The blacksmith's lips curved into a gentle, reassuring smile. "Now, I see you."